Happy New Year to all of you. We'll begin the very first webinar of this year by Global NK, Zoom and Connect. Global NK is a web journal and a project of East Asia Institute to provide various views and materials on North Korea, inter-Korean relations, and Korea's relations with international society. My name is Chaesung Chun, a moderator today. I work for the EAI as a member of editorial board committee of Global NK. At the beginning of this year, Kim Jong Un made a wrapping up speech of the 5-day plenary meeting of the ruling Workers' Party Central Committee. He primarily focused on domestic agendas, especially economic challenges and anti-virus campaign that lie ahead, without mentioning much about diplomatic engagement with the South and the United States. And the North Korea claimed that they test-fired a hypersonic missile on January 5th, and they said it has strategic significance in that they hastened a task for modernizing strategic armed force of the state put forward at the 8th Party Congress and help fulfill the most important core task out of 5 top priority tasks for the strategic arms sector in the 5-year plan. So we have only North Korea's action, but not much talk to anticipate what the year 2022 will be in a relation with North Korea. To discuss these matters, we have a very impressive panel today. I will introduce very shortly in an alphabetical order of the last names. First, we have Professor Leif-Eric Easley, a colleague of mine at Ewha Women's University. He's also a member of the editorial board committee of Global NK, and he actually coined the subtitle of Global NK journal, Zoom and Connect. Next, we have Mr. Evans Revere, senior fellow at Brookings Institution. He's very well known internationally and has provided valuable insights on Korean and regional matters. Next, we have Dr. Sung Ki-young, Director of the Department of Foreign Policy Research at Institute for National Security Strategy. He's a specialist in international affairs and security issues, and also in Korean matters, including North Korean problems. So in this webinar, I have 3 questions, and I will ask each panelist to give their insights to each of them. So the first question is about the New Year's report by Kim Jong Un. What are the main strategic contents shown in the Central Committee's plenary meeting and plenum report by Kim Jong Un? And what was the strategic priority manifested in the plenary meeting? So let me invite Dr. Sung first, please. So you are on mute.
Thank you very much for organizing this timely event. Regarding your first question, my first impression about the outcome of this plenary meeting was that there was no dramatic wording or a new eye-catching slogan at this time. But still, the top priority of this plenary meeting was economy, how to recover the North Korean economy. Let me briefly sketch out where the North Korean economy is right now, based on some statistics. As you know, the worst period of North Korean economy over the last several decades was the mid-1990s, during which North Korea faced the Great Famine that killed many millions of people. North Korea recorded minus GDP growth for 9 consecutive years in the 1990s. The worst economic achievement for North Korea was 1997. At that time, the GDP growth of the country was minus 6.7 in comparison with the previous year. And if you look at the recent Bank of Korea data, North Korea's GDP in 2020 contracted by 4.5%, which recorded the second largest fall in the recent economic history of North Korea, following 6.7 in 1997. This shows that North Korean economy is a really, really dire situation right now. So it was my assumption that North Korea will present any drastic idea or plan to revive its economy in the New Year's message. But as we know, no meaningful and drastic idea was suggested. For example, the first year accomplishment of the 5-year economic development plan, which was declared in January last year, should have been announced in this plenary meeting, I think, according to the past practices of North Korean politics. But North Korea failed to announce even whether or not to meet the first year target. This is my first takeaway. And secondly, the food problem was discussed intensively in this plenary meeting. Basically, there were 6 major agendas in this plenary meeting. Among the 6 agendas, the economy, the socialist way to increase agricultural productivity was the only real policy-related agenda in the 5-day meeting. The rest of the meeting agenda was about, for example, the restructuring of the party organization or the revision of the party bylaw or national budget, etc. And North Korea has recently been emphasizing nationwide support for the agricultural industry, such as improvement of rural village environment and technological support and consolidation of state leadership to boost food productivity. But at the same time, this state-led campaign is expected to be pursued not only by government effort for technological innovation or incentive system, but by requiring ideological armament of the people and cultural renovation of the people. The significance of the so-called trilateral combination of ideology and technology and culture in pursuing agricultural innovation in North Korea was already declared by Kim Jong Un last year in November at the so-called the event 3 Revolutions Red Flags Achievement Movement. However, again, I'm still pessimistic in predicting the prospect of North Korea's economy to resolve to this chronic food problem following the decision of this plenary meeting, because very few policy tools to achieve the goal were presented in this meeting, apart from psychological mobilization of the people and ideological armament, and a series of measures to improve the living environment of farmers. So I'm still pessimistic.
Thank you. Let me give you a follow-up question. You may want to answer after one round of talks. So we have 10 years of Kim Jong-un's rule, but economic situation still is very dire. So do you think this economic situation will affect his political foundation in short or long term? So that's my question. Second, let me invite Professor Easley, please.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to join distinguished colleagues for this timely discussion. The 4th plenary of the Workers' Party 8th Central Committee outlined new policies, including for developing rural areas and defending socialist culture, as has been mentioned by my colleagues. We can expect, I think, these policies, at least some of them, to be passed into law by the Supreme People's Assembly early this year. These high-profile meetings are meant to show a responsiveness to domestic challenges in North Korea and a sort of normalization of governance compared to the past. But I'm afraid that they're largely Kim Jong Un's attempt at maintaining loyalty and discipline. Kim is trying to show he has the will and ability to lead North Korea through and beyond COVID-related challenges. Yet as far as one can glean from the readout of the plenary, the Workers' Party's policy ideas are really uninspiring. When the third generation of leadership took the helm in North Korea, there could have perhaps been some significant changes in policy. But despite a taste for the international and obvious ambitions for economic growth, Kim has prioritized nuclearization over the benefits of denuclearization. He has repeated failures of his predecessors' Juche self-reliance and socialist ideologies, while cracking down on the informal markets that many North Koreans use to survive. Pyongyang's economic policies are thus unsustainable, but also its strategy of blackmailing its neighbors appears to currently be on hold. Yes, the North Koreans tested what they claim is a hypersonic missile on January 5th, excuse me. But I think further military provocations will be on hold for some time because of the Beijing Olympics. At the same time, a meaningful diplomatic initiative is implausible during the spread of a novel coronavirus variant. With Omicron, I don't expect the North Koreans to be coming out for diplomacy. So it looks to me like North Korea in 2022 is going to be working to survive the pandemic. And they're going to be doing that largely by staying the course, playing up self-isolation as self-reliance, and continuing to rely on Chinese aid.
Thank you. Very comprehensive overview. Let me ask you a little bit different question. You've been working on women's rights or women's situations in North Korea, which is quite much under-researched, but very important agenda. So can you talk a little bit more about the women's health situation or human rights situation in North Korea after the round, please?
With pleasure.
Hey, yep, sure. Let me now turn the floor to Mr. Revere, please.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chun, and it's an honor for me to be able to participate in this webinar. Sorry I can't be in Seoul to do it. I'm here in Spain, but I was particularly eager to join this distinguished group and be a part of a very timely discussion. It's pretty clear from what we've seen of the outcome of the plenum that North Korea is struggling economically and agriculturally. And so economic recovery and food production are predictably going to be central elements of the party's and the nation's work plan for 2022. But to be frank, our ability to understand the actual depth of its current crisis and the full range of plans that North Korea has for this year is very limited by the way that the regime reported on this Korean Workers' Party plenum. This is something that my two colleagues touched on a moment ago, but I really want to underscore this, that the way that the regime rolled out the results of the plenum is curious indeed. Kim Jong Un's remarks were referenced, of course, in the North Korean official media, but no actual text of his statement was released. Nor, of course, did he deliver a New Year's speech to the nation that we've often seen him deliver in the past. There was surely more, much more to his remarks at the plenum than has been revealed publicly. What he told the Central Committee may well have been franker and blunter than what we have heard reported to date. To me, this suggests that the regime may have felt it important not to allow the outside world to know the full extent of its difficulties, nor to permit its adversaries, including the United States, to understand the DPRK's plans for dealing with all of the challenges that it faces. Secrecy and hiding its cards have always been part of the regime's approach to the outside world, and I think it's fair to assume that they still are. As a longtime North Korea watcher, I find it incomprehensible that Kim Jong Un did not dwell on foreign affairs, on relations with the United States, defense and security matters, including the nuclear and missile programs, North-South relations, and ties with China in his remarks at the plenum. All of these things have been central components of Kim's game plan as leader, and some of them have even been areas where he has managed to achieve major success, at least from his perspective. So are we supposed to believe that Kim Jong Un did not lay out his priorities and talk about his strategy for achieving them at this important end-of-year party meeting on the issues that I just mentioned? The absence of reporting on these matters by the North Korean media should not be interpreted, in my view, as meaning that they were not raised. And I think we need to be careful about that. I also think it's important for us to be very careful in our judgments about what North Korea is up to or not up to, and what Pyongyang intends to do in the coming months. It's possible that the strategic priorities revealed by the limited reporting on the plenum that we've seen so far will give us a hint about Pyongyang's plans and intentions. But I also think it's possible that they may also be designed to misinform and mislead us. So I think a note of caution is in order here, and we ought to be careful about jumping to any conclusions about what North Korea plans to do in 2022.
Thank you. Very interesting. So the limited revelation of the party plenum's contents is very interesting. How do you think it will be accepted by American specialists or policymakers? This a little bit exceptional change of the New Year's situation. And also, probably I'll ask later, but will this situation affect the American priority in their foreign policy agendas? Because US is confronted with many domestic issues and other foreign policy issues as well. So generally, after 1 year of President Biden's taking office, probably the priority is falling down from the list. I don't know, so please give me some insight. Okay, let me turn to Dr. Sung again for the question, please.
Oh yeah, as you said in the question, I agree that the economic situation will do affect the political foundation and political leadership. But I think the way the Kim Jong Un is going to respond to this situation is slightly different. For example, North Korean state media has recently begun to use the word 수령 or Kim Jong Unism in portraying what's going on inside North Korean leadership and North Korean politics. 수령 is something that is called, that is used when the state media and North Korean people call only Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il, especially after they died. But what the fact that North Korean state media began to use the word 수령 and Kim Jong-unism during his reign, what it means is North Korean leadership is going to tackle this dire situation by strengthening the idolization of their top leader. So what Kim Jong-il want to deliver is that North Korean people are required to endure these economic difficulties by strengthening their ideological armament and by putting a more higher level of economic and the ideological indoctrination. That is the way the Kim Jong-un is going to tackle to prevent the economic difficulties from developing into the political crisis.
Thank you very much. So with this economic difficulties, how longer can Kim Jong-un can survive politically? I think that will be an important question. Okay, Professor Easley, please.
Thank you so much for asking about women's rights in North Korea. Of course, before the pandemic, the situation for women's rights in the DPRK was dire indeed, with very poor public health conditions for public health issues that are of particular concern for women, with very severe and frequent incidents of sexual violence without significant legal recourse and protections. And of course, many other forms of human rights violations that women and men suffer in North Korea. These were all very serious and I think well outlined by the Commission of Inquiry report, which I believe all our colleagues are familiar with. But one of the things that my co-author, Sarah Kim, and I wrote about in Ethics and International Affairs was, despite the terrible women's rights situation in North Korea, women were also an under-recognized part of success stories in North Korea regarding their economic activities. So women are disproportionately the actors engaged in informal markets, engaged in lifting up the North Korean economy through informal trade. And of course, were essential to the trade in household and other goods across the North Korea-China border in order to bring items that were in demand by North Korean families, but also to raise revenue and bring income to many North Korean families who are having difficulty surviving on the state-controlled or state-led economic system. So really, female entrepreneurs are as important an overlooked story in North Korea as North Korean women's rights. But then with the pandemic, of course, North Korea locked down its borders to an extent and now at a duration that far exceeds its previous border lockdowns in instances of SARS and MERS, for example. And these North Korean female entrepreneurs are largely cut off from supply chains in China. Their activities have been clamped down because of virus prevention measures, but also because of the ideological campaigns that have been mentioned by my colleagues. And so what you have under the current coronavirus situation, which, as Evans Revere very correctly cautioned us, makes it very difficult to look inside North Korea, even more difficult than it was before the pandemic. But I think I can say with some confidence, what you have is a situation in North Korea where the women's rights conditions have worsened, and yet the women's opportunities of entrepreneurialism and market activity have been curtailed significantly. And so the pandemic is really dealing a double blow to the conditions of women in North Korea, both in terms of public health and freedom on the one hand, and in terms of their economic abilities and activities on the other.
Thank you very much. The purpose of Global NK actually is to do research on the very broad basis of North Korea, social, cultural, and political base. And I think in this sense, Professor Easley's research and remarks are very important. Okay, Mr. Revere, please.
In response to the 2 points, the 2 questions that you posed, first of all, I think it's incumbent on all of us who watch North Korea carefully to be at least a bit skeptical about what we've seen in this recent plenum. Not enough of us have pointed out the concern that I laid out in my opening remarks, that this is an unusual way of rolling out the results of a major party central committee plenum. A couple of people have pointed to this and noted that there's something odd going on here. I think Rudiger Frank, in a recent article, said, expressed some curiosity and suspicion about what is happening by virtue of the fact that so little has been reported and very almost no quotes have been provided about what Kim Jong Un actually said. So I think all of us going forward need to give this a hard look and a skeptical look, particularly on the issue that I raised about how likely is it that a major party meeting took place and there were no references to the United States, nuclear weapons, strategy, China, South Korea, North-South relations, et cetera. It just, once again, it just defies credibility for me. On the other point that you made about the Biden administration, it's pretty clear, based on what we've seen so far, that North Korea is not a top priority for the United States right now. There are other things going on, particularly relations with China, relations with Russia, our internal political situation in the United States, the pandemic, all of those things are urgent matters for this administration. And in the absence of a major provocation by North Korea, the Biden administration has settled into a sort of a wait and see posture. Some people have called it, well, a wait and see posture is probably the best way to describe what the administration is doing right now. The mantra of U.S. willingness to sit down with North Korea and to engage with North Korea is still repeated periodically, but you don't see the administration making any significant steps or taking any significant measures to re-engage with North Korea. And so there's a certain interesting stability to where we are right now. The United States doesn't feel compelled to do anything because there's not a lot of excitement going on in the Korean Peninsula right now, and North Korea is not provoking for a change. But at the same time, North Korea is sitting on its new status as a de facto nuclear weapon state and reaping the benefits thereof, and does not seem to have any sense of urgency about re-engaging with the United States. So at least at this point, things seem to be calm and will probably remain so until one day when they're not. And we can talk some more about that as we respond to the next couple of questions.
Thank you very much. That last remark leads us to the second question, which is about the future of denuclearization negotiation, which is very difficult to anticipate. And there are many webinars, I think, in Seoul or in the States about this problem. So what will be North Korea's strategy for the negotiation with the United States and South Korea? Will this economic hardship be a driver for Kim Jong Un to come to the negotiation table? And what will be the future of this current government, South Korean government's efforts for the end of war declaration? We have only 2 months before the South Korean presidential election. So everything is not very certain. And also we have a Beijing Olympics 1 month after today. So North Korea's test fire of the so-called hypersonic missile probably will irritate China's thinking. So everything is happening without a very clear clue for the future. But we have to tackle with this idea of the future of nuclear denuclearization negotiation. So let me first go to Professor Easley, please.
Well, thank you. I'm joining some of the best North Korea watchers on this call. So what I'm going to say will not be a surprise to my colleagues here, but I think that Kim's nuclear and missile programs have exceeded the projections of many analysts and continue to develop despite relative outward quiet and what we presume to be some pretty significant internal suffering inside North Korea. So I think that the DPRK is likely to push ahead, almost certainly push ahead with many of its military modernizations in 2022. And sometime after the Beijing Olympics, I'm not willing to put a wager on whether they will do so before the next South Korean president enters the Blue House or relatively soon thereafter. but I do expect them to resume their weapons testing later this year. And at this point, it's frankly hard to imagine the Kim regime seriously engaging in denuclearization unless it believes that the continuation of the regime depends on it. And bringing about that sort of calculus in Pyongyang would likely require a unity of purpose among Washington, Seoul, and Tokyo, a much more cooperative Beijing, and some bottom-up pressures inside North Korea for political economic reform, which would increase the desire for sanctions relief and international cooperation. I think all three of those conditions are goals worth working toward, but progress this year will probably be limited and uneven. In the meantime, what I'd like to stress is that Washington, Seoul, and Tokyo are capable of managing the North Korean threat by increasing security cooperation for deterrence, reinvigorating international sanctions while granting exemptions for aid, and expanding multilateral pressure on both Pyongyang and Beijing. The pandemic has shone a light on geopolitical rivalries, domestic political divisions, and frankly, dysfunctional governance around the world. The world has bigger concerns than North Korea right now. And Pyongyang likes to pretend that it can do without the world. But I think we shouldn't give up hope that the Kim regime will finally accept international offers of humanitarian assistance. There should be more multilateral planning to help the North Korean people with food, medicine, vaccines, and essential supplies delivered in creative ways that can overcome virus transmission concerns and many political obstacles.
Okay, you touched upon many important questions. So let me ask two questions. The first one is, at the later part of your remark, you touched upon the some multilateral humanitarian assistance, but so far North Korea rejects any vaccine support or so. So what will be the reason for that? Probably they are afraid of the inflow of the virus. So purely the medical reasons, but also probably other reasons. So I want to hear your perspective on that. And second one, you touched upon trilateral thing. So there is a general trend that East Asia is bifurcated between two camps. So there will be another trilateral between North Korea, China, and Russia. And Kim Jong Un last year, probably in August, he himself defined the current international situation as a new Cold War. So it's very interesting that Kim Jong Un wants to have a normal country, not in the sense of the shape of his country, but also in his perception of international situations. So he tried to put forward some more views on international situations as a general. So if you have any ideas about how Kim Jong Un perceives the current regional situation rather than the peninsula situation, it will be a very important question or point to discuss about. Thank you very much. And next, Mr. Revere, please.
As I suggested earlier, what we've seen thus far from Pyongyang's very limited revelations about the party plenum tells us very little and possibly nothing about the regime's game plan vis-a-vis its external strategy and its nuclear program. In my view, we would be foolish to think that the regime intends to focus solely on economic and food-related matters, and also foolish to think that it doesn't have a very well-calibrated plan for dealing with the United States, the ROK, and China. North Korea is now a de facto nuclear weapons power, and it has, as my colleague just suggested, it has every intention of remaining as one. We should expect the regime to take steps to strengthen its nuclear arsenal, as well as its missile-related capabilities. And indeed, as it's already been suggested, the missile test that we just saw is evidence that the regime has every intention of doing just that. This is now business as usual for North Korea. But the regime also knows that renewed nuclear weapons and/or long-range ballistic missile testing would almost certainly recreate the crisis that we saw back in 2017. It would anger and alienate the Chinese, and it would also cause the United States to adopt harsh measures in response. The good news, I think, is that this understanding may make the Pyongyang regime more cautious than it has been in the past. But the bad news is that North Korea has often over the years defied what we perceive to be in its best interests. And it has acted in dangerous and provocative ways, often just because it can. North Korea has achieved remarkable success in ensuring that the Republic of Korea continues to pursue a concessionary policy towards the DPRK, almost regardless of the North Korean regime's behavior, and certainly regardless of North Korea's often contemptuous treatment of South Korea. So we should expect Pyongyang to, as it has often done over the years, to find a way to cast a vote in the upcoming South Korean presidential election in order to try to ensure a progressive victory and the continuation of this concessionary policy by Seoul. Meanwhile, North Korea's difficult economic and food situation requires the regime to find ways to alleviate the pressure of international sanctions, secure adequate food and energy supplies, and ensure stable economic growth. And of course, good relations with China are important to these goals. So we should expect the regime to continue its efforts to stabilize and further improve ties with Beijing. But quite frankly, we shouldn't rule out the possibility that Pyongyang will also reach out to the United States to explore whether Washington is amenable to a dialogue on sanctions easing. But don't expect that the North Korean regime will be willing to do this year what it was not prepared to do at the Hanoi summit, and that is commit to serious, irreversible denuclearization steps in return for sanctions easing. North Korea remains convinced, in my view, that it can have nuclear weapons, long-range ballistic missiles, and obtain sanctions relief. And finally, the North Korean regime is counting on South Korea to help it achieve a number of goals by making the case to Washington for preemptive sanctions easing steps by the United States. And Pyongyang also hopes that a sympathetic government in Seoul will continue to urge the United States to downsize or end joint exercises, military exercises, and accept an end of war declaration that Pyongyang, in my view, would ultimately use as a pretext to demand the end of the US military presence in the ROK. Let me stop there.
Thank you very much. Very accurate account of what North Korea is thinking and will do this year. In South Korea, there are many analysts and also public curious about the US response to Korean affairs, especially we have midterm election in the United States. So the factor of midterm election, will it make the Biden administration more focused on domestic issues rather than North Korea, making North Korean issue fall down in priority? And also, there is some prospect, we don't know yet, but if the current administration loses, their seats in both Congresses, then probably from next year, it's too early, but they will focus much more on foreign issues because they cannot do much with the great opposition from the Congress. So will there be more chance for American government focus more on North Korea after the midterm election? It's a very wild guess, but we anyway want to know the effect of midterm election. Thank you. Now let me turn to Dr. Sung, please.
Thank you. Let me start by slightly touching on the recent launch of hypersonic missile of North Korea. What North Korea claimed at this time is this test successfully showed high technology, such as irregular maneuvering of the missile and the ability to avoid radar detection. If that is true, North Koreans are joining a small number of countries such as the United States and Russia and China that has successfully developed hypersonic missiles. So this launch should be taken very seriously in terms of the future possibility of our denuclearization talks with North Korea. What is more, there is a pretty long list of strategic weapons development plan in North Korea. This plan was announced at the 8th Party Congress January last year, a year ago. If you look at the detail of this plan, the plan includes not only a hypersonic missiles development, but also much more than that. For example, even nuclear submarine or even spy satellites. So North Korea is expected to continue to develop its military capability without relying on external powers. Furthermore, there is 5-year National Defense Technology and Weapon System Development Plan in North Korea. This is also announced at the 8th Party Congress a year ago. This plan aims at building and developing a variety of ecosystem to efficiently operate its current nuclear capability. Therefore, North Korea is expected to put focus on further developing its military capability, along with its self-rehabilitation strategy on the economic side, which was already declared in 2019, rather than considering the resumption of nuclear dialogue. So my conclusion is that the resumption of nuclear talks is unlikely to happen, at least for the time being. Although North Korea claimed the triumph of their Byungjin policy in April 2018, after they declared the completion of nuclear force as a result of the launch of Hwasong 15, actually they continue to develop their nuclear capability based on what they call diversification and miniaturization strategy of the nuclear arsenal. And this year, once again, it was proven that North Korea's top priority is still domestic stability and power consolidation of Kim Jong Un. So unless Pyongyang reaches a conclusion that the resumption of talks with the United States or South Korea will be helpful or will be effective means in accomplishing such a strategic goal, power consolidation of Kim Jong Un or strengthening domestic stability, North Korea seems not willing to come back to the negotiation table anytime soon. As my colleague said, another possibility, the future uncertainty coming from the result of South Korea's presidential election in March and US midterm election in November. These factors also led North Korea to maintain wait-and-see position. And the spread of Omicron variant and the continued blockade caused by the COVID-19 keeps preventing North Korea from resuming interactions with outside world. So all in all, I'm really pessimistic about the possibility of the resumption of nuclear talks.
Thank you. Very important point. So the test firing of this series of strategic weapons, is it a part of the negotiation tactic, or is it a part of a more long-term military build-up roadmap, especially in terms of, as I said, the coming of new Cold War situation in Kim Jong-un's mind? So Kim Jong-un is only 38 this year, so he is planning probably 40 years plan for his rulership. So he's planning to have a very militarily strong and economically prosperous country in his mind. So how we can evaluate his his ways of, test firing these new strategic weapons? Is it probably they have dual function for negotiation also, the military building up for the longer future. So can you add something about this military aspect of inter-Korean relations? And also we have to strengthen our military deterrence posture, which also affects the Kim Jong Un's perception that South Korea is becoming very much aggressive, applying the so-called two standards from the United States and South Korea. So how can we overcome that? Well, it's a big subject, but let me hear some, well, rather, concise answers from all three panelists. First, Professor Easley, please.
Thank you. You asked about why North Korea rejects humanitarian assistance, and I think there's at least three reasons why we observe this. The first is their virus transmission concerns. Because North Korea has such a inadequate health infrastructure, their response to such a threatening infectious disease as a novel coronavirus is to maintain severe isolation. So they don't want to open the door a crack and let the virus in at this point. I think that's reason number one. Reason number two is that they don't appear to be convinced that the vaccines would get them out of the pandemic. And they're also concerned about the safety or efficacy of vaccines. The number of vaccines that have been offered to them is insufficient for a fast and rapid massive vaccine campaign in the country. So I think that they want a lot of effective, safe vaccines at the same time so that they can vaccinate their population very quickly. And of course, it's difficult to do that if the world doesn't have sufficient shipments to send them, as we're all going after booster shots and so on. And as North Korea doesn't have the cold chain infrastructure to transport the mRNA vaccines inside the country. So those are things that can be addressed, but as of now, I think it makes the North Koreans hesitant to accept humanitarian assistance, because vaccines are probably the first humanitarian assistance they really need. And a third reason, I think, has to do with regime legitimacy. They, as my colleagues have said, are very fixated on avoiding signs of internal or external weakness. And ultimately, I think they may be willing to manage some trade-offs of external assistance and regime legitimacy. But the priority now, it seems, is to crack down and increase control first. The second question you asked me is about trilateral cooperation. And I think that, we see Korea-Japan relations strained by how two democracies are dealing with history issues, much older than the Cold War. But I'm optimistic that these two US allies will be able to make progress this year with new leadership in both capitals. And in the meantime, you asked about North Korea's perspective on the regional situation and trilateral cooperation. I think North Korea's approach is, rather than pay for benefits in an exchange in negotiations, North Korea wants free concessions by exploiting divisions among its neighbors. And North Korea has a very impressive track record of implementing that sort of strategy. So perhaps North Korea wants to exploit a new Cold War, but I don't think what we're observing in Northeast Asia, or in the world for that matter, is really a new Cold War. I think we're not in a new bipolar order. There is an international order, and it is under tremendous stress. And the question is whether states will rally to defend and upgrade the order, including by dealing with challenges emanating from Beijing. And I think that's a primary question for trilateral cooperation among Washington, Seoul, and Tokyo. And it's one that Pyongyang is hoping that the United States and its allies will have a lot of difficulty pursuing, because the North Korean regime wants to exploit the divisions for its benefit.
Thank you very much. Mr. Revere, please.
You posed a very good question about US politics and where things may be headed. At this moment in time, America is very much fixated on what is largely a domestic agenda, driven by the pandemic, driven by the shocking events of January 6th of last year and the effect that has had on political stability and the political fortunes of the United States. And I expect the United States to be very much focused on those things continually throughout the rest of the year through the midterm elections. To the extent that foreign affairs becomes a hot topic, if you will, during and after the midterm elections, the number one issue is likely to be U.S.-China relations and the perceived threat from China. Secondarily, perhaps Russia will be a concern, not the least of which is because the Russians obviously had been making some efforts to interfere in American politics in recent years. But I just don't see the North Korea issue rising to the top of the heap in the context of our midterm election or even thereafter, unless, and this is an important caveat, unless once again, North Korea returns to an old game plan of using provocation, using nuclear and or ballistic missile tests again. And if that's the case, then you'll see the North Korea issue once again rise to the top of the heap. But at least at this point, if you're looking for foreign policy and its connection to the midterm election, look to issues like China and Russia, which I think will be a lot more likely than North Korea at this point. The United States, as I suggested earlier, the administration is largely in a passive mode with respect to the North Korea issue. Some people have described it as strategic patience 2.0. It's probably not an unfair characterization. But for now, it's China, Russia, and internal developments that I think are going to be driving the political conversation in the United States in the run-up to and through the midterm election.
Yes, that's very helpful. Leslie?
I think, first of all, we need to remember that the fact that in the presidential election in March, whoever elected, he is going to be the third South Korean counterpart of Kim Jong Un. One of the most stressful factors in North Korea in designing and implementing any kind of agreement with external powers is the power change in democratic country. So what Kim Jong Un has in mind is he will need a long-term plan, regardless of power change in South Korea and the United States. So I think there was a dual purpose of the recent development of strategic assets and strategic weapons, negotiation tactics, and the long-term plan. But I think the second one is going to be strengthened in Kim Jong Un's calculation. That is why, for the time being, North Korea wanted to further develop strategic weapons based on their own 5-year military build-up plan and strategy. How can we overcome or prevent that kind of strategy? I have no definite answer, but what I can say is that as we remember in the Singapore Declaration, we have 3 key elements of that. First one is establishing a US-DPRK new relationship and the lasting peace regime on the Korean Peninsula and the full complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. We have been much talking about the technically defined denuclearization process of the Korean Peninsula, a roadmap and verification declaration and full denuclearization, something like that. But we did not talk about the first and second one, the US DPLK normalization of relations and the lasting and durable peace regime. So what North Korea wants is let's build up a military capability in preparation for the future, where the relevant parties can gather together and discuss how to assure North Korea's security. That kind of military capability is going to be the leverage and asset in preparation for the future negotiation. Also, the next president needs to consider seriously the role of China. As long as China is going to be ready to spoil the Korean Peninsula peace process, unlike China's constructive role in the six-party talks as an honest broker from 2003 to 2008, the real progress of the Korean Peninsula peace process is not easy. So the task of the next president in dealing with North Korean nuclear problem is, I think, how to hammer out China's constructive role in pushing forward the Korean Peninsula peace process.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much. The purpose of Song's last remarks also leads us to the last question. We are running out of time. So let me ask you, what should we do or should we not do in terms of RK-US alliance or thinking of US-China rivalry? So please give me the last relatively short remarks without follow-up question from me. So let me turn to Mr. Revere first this time.
Thank you very much. Very timely question. Increased US-China tensions, greater strategic rivalry between the United States and China, and intense great power competition, I think, are likely to characterize the East Asia region for a long time to come. We are witnessing the birth of what some have called a new Cold War with important new characteristics, including the fact that the two contending powers, the United States and the PRC, are not only ideological rivals, but are also economically interdependent. The United States is currently embarked on an effort to build a coalition of the willing to push back against the PRC's aggressive approach in the region, to deal with Beijing's attempts to intimidate its neighbors, to try to contend with the PRC's efforts to dominate key technologies, and also to respond to China's desire to become the dominant actor in the region and beyond. There's also deep concern about China's internal situation, including its terrible human rights abuses, its suppression of basic freedoms, and its disturbing treatment of ethnic minorities in Xinjiang and Tibet. Japan, Australia, the UK, India, and other major international actors are aligning themselves with the United States in this effort to deal with China's behavior. I think others are going to follow. As for Pyongyang's relations with China, North Korea took steps to, as I called it at the time, took steps to renormalize ties with China in 2018, 2019, after the serious downturn in relations witnessed between the two in 2017. Pyongyang is, of course, deeply dependent on China and on Beijing's willingness to look the other way instead of enforcing international sanctions. This seems unlikely to change in the coming months. The PRC has also come to accept, albeit reluctantly, the fact that the DPRK is now a de facto nuclear state. And Beijing, of course, shares Pyongyang's goal of trying to undermine the US-ROK alliance and remove US forces from the peninsula. The growing US-China rivalry has placed the ROK in a very difficult position. Seoul believes that it can balance a strong security relationship with the United States and a robust economic relationship with China. It's not clear to me, quite frankly, that this is going to be possible, especially if US-China ties take a turn for the worse. There are already voices in the United States calling for the ROK to make clear where it stands. The next ROK government will need to make a decision about Korea's future, keeping in mind the vital importance of its alliance with the United States and the role of that alliance in preserving South Korea's independence. Also, including the need to find a way to try to coexist with the PRC. And of course, the knowledge that at the end of the day, the PRC is allied with North Korea, whose goal remains the reunification of the Korean nation under its rule. As the next ROK government tries to make its decision about what to do, I remain hopeful that the Republic of Korea will make the right choice. So let me just stop there.
Thank you very much. Next, Dr. Song, please.
I'm sorry. Let me try to be quick. I'm going to just touch on the North Korea's calculation and China's strategic consideration on US-China rivalry in dealing with North Korea problem on the Korean Peninsula. If you look at the recent exchange of messages between President Xi Jinping and Chairman Kim Jong Un, the messages contains, I think, three common elements. First one is a traditional blood alliance between the two countries. And second one is friendship and reciprocity from their father's generation. Those are traditional way of describing the relationship between Pyongyang and Beijing. But the third one is emphasizing the changing political environment. The changing political environment specifically emphasized by Pyongyang means no other than US-China strategic competition. Actually, from the beginning, North Korea assertively defined the US-China relations as a new Cold War and consistently emphasized the confrontational nature of the mutual competition between the two superpowers. In doing so, North Korea makes an attempt to utilize the development of US-China rivalry for its own survival under the prolonged economic sanctions. We need to remember that such a diplomatic maneuver of North Korea between the two rival superpowers was pretty much familiar behavior in North Korea's diplomacy. That is Kim Jong Un's father has done, and that is Kim Jong Un's grandfather, Kim Il Sung, has done between the two superpowers. If you look at China's side of things, the strategic calculation of China that regards North Korea as a buffer zone and regards North Korea, regards the relations with North Korea as lips and teeth relations, seems to be strengthened in the future. And China's old perception, which regards the countries joining the Korean War as a proud determination to resist the United States aggression and by aiding North Korea, what we call Hangmi Wonjo. This notion seems to be revived in the wake of the escalated tension between the United States and China. China wants to maintain its economic leverage, not to give up the country's political influence on North Korea, and to use the geostrategic position of North Korea as a buffer zone against the US. So the denuclearization negotiation process is captured by this kind of geopolitical situation. It's going to be very difficult to find a breakthrough. Last but not least, the next president of South Korea, he's also expected to face very tough conditions with regards to how to jumpstart the dialogue with North Korea. Whoever is elected, he will face two very tough conditions, one in Washington and the other in Pyongyang. In Washington, he will face very widespread fatigue in dealing with North Korea. And in Pyongyang, he will face distrust toward his government. So I would like to argue that both Seoul and Washington governments are required to raise the priority of North Korean issue to prevent Pyongyang from returning the diplomatic stage around the Korean Peninsula with a renewed threat and another round of crisis. That kind of approach should be priority for both governments here in Seoul and Washington.
Thank you very much. Lastly, Professor Easley, please.
Well, I want to thank my colleagues for their sobering insights, but I also want to wish success for President Moon's 11th hour's efforts at engagement. I think it's a good strategy to try to institutionalize inter-Korean relations, to provide guardrails against conflict, and to develop incentives for sustainable cooperation. It's desirable also to have continuity in ROK policy from administration to administration. The Moon government has been consistent about dialogue over its years in office in an attempt to build trust with North Korea. The reason this hasn't worked is because of policy choices in Pyongyang. US-China rivalry isn't the main obstacle to denuclearization talks, an end-of-war declaration, or even diplomacy on the sidelines of the Beijing Olympics. The main obstacle is the Kim regime practicing its own version of strategic patience toward Washington and its own hostile policy toward Seoul. And that's why South Korea is investing more in its own security. The next government can be expected to continue many of the Moon administration's capability upgrades. And Seoul shouldn't give in to Chinese pressure, whether in the form of economic coercion against deployments like THAAD, attempts to shift blame on to US alliance defensive exercises, or maritime and airspace security challenges caused by China's fishermen and military expansion. Beyond the peninsula, South Korea has a major stake in the international order for its economic security. So I expect the next administration will uphold that order out of national interest and international responsibility, even if Seoul's contributions to global public goods, support of the US-ROK alliance, and defense of international norms upsets Beijing. So in conclusion, Seoul should not allow US-China rivalry to be an excuse. It should not be an excuse for South Korea's policy toward the North not working. It should not be a reason for the ROK to hold back in contributing to global public goods. And it certainly should not prevent South Korea from defending its own national interests and sovereignty.
Well, thank you very much. I think we covered many issues at the very first week of this year. There are so many uncertainties. I think we need to get together again, and Global NK will probably invite you again. And especially, I thank Mr. Revere. It's very late at night, so it must be a difficulty in your time zone. So I think we did a lot in terms of evaluation, prediction, and also prescription. So thank you very much, and I'll see you again. So let me close the session. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Wonderful.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.